25, I found myself in the middle of my own dojo, encircled by pupils who gazed at me as if I were some sort of deity. They absorbed every word, mimicked every motion, and believed I held all the solution. In that instant, observing their reverent expressions, I experienced something more frightening than any adversary I had ever encountered. I felt like an imposter. Not because I lacked skill, not because I hadn't earned my position, but because I suddenly grasped something that would shatter everything I believed about knowledge, about mastery, about what it truly means to learn. That evening, alone in my training space, I uncovered the most perilous foe any warrior can confront. And it's not what you might expect. It's not fear. It's not uncertainty. It's not even defeat. It's the instant you start believing you understand something, the instant you think you've made it. The instant you cease being a learner and start being an instructor who has forgotten how to learn. You see, I had spent years gathering knowledge like a collector, amassing treasures. I knew countless techniques, numerous forms, various combat styles. My mind was a vault of martial arts wisdom, and I was proud of how much I had stored. But that night, something changed. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, and instead of seeing a master, I saw something that chilled me. I saw someone who had become so full of what he knew that there was no room left for what he didn't know. No, I saw someone who had traded the endless possibilities of a beginner's mind for the false security of expertise. And in that moment, I understood why so many masters become captives of their own knowledge. Listen closely, because what I'm about to share with you isn't just about martial arts or combat or even physical training. This is about the secret that separates those who continue growing throughout their entire lives from those who stop evolving the moment they achieve their first taste of success. This is about why the most dangerous thing that can happen to any human being isn't failure. It's the belief that they figured it out. You feel it too, don't you? That subtle shift that happens when you become competent at something. When people start coming to you for advice. When you find yourself explaining rather than exploring, that's the moment. That's when the real enemy strikes. Not with violence, not with aggression, but with the whisper that says you've learned enough, enough. You are enough as you are. But here's what I discovered that night in front of my mirror, and it changed everything. True learning, real learning, the kind that transforms not just what you do, but who you are, begins with one of the most terrifying acts a human being can perform. It begins with admitting that everything you think you know might be wrong. Every technique you've mastered, every principle you've accepted, every truth you've embraced, all of it must be placed on the altar of possibility and examined with fresh eyes. This isn't about becoming ignorant again. This is about becoming wise enough to recognize that wisdom itself is just another form of ignorance if it stops you from continuing to learn. I remember the exact moment this truth hit me like a lightning bolt. I was demonstrating a technique I had performed thousands of times, a movement so familiar it felt like breathing. My student attempted to copy it, but something was wrong, not with his execution, but with my teaching. I watched him struggle, and suddenly I realized I had been teaching him the technique as I understood it 5 years ago, not as I might understand it today if I approached it with fresh eyes. I had become so attached to my version of the truth that I had stopped allowing that truth to evolve. I was teaching from memory, not from present moment awareness. I was sharing knowledge, not facilitating discovery. That's when I understood the most profound paradox in all of learning. The more you know, the less you understand, unless you consciously choose to know nothing. Think about it. When you first started learning anything, remember that feeling? That sense of wonder, that curiosity, that willingness to make mistakes and look foolish? You weren't protecting an image of yourself as knowledgeable. You weren't defending previous investments in learning. You were simply open, receptive, eager. You were like an empty cup, ready to be filled. But as you accumulated knowledge, something insidious happened. You started protecting what you had learned. You began defending your understanding rather than expanding it. You became more interested in being right than in discovering truth. I spent the next several months conducting an experiment that would fundamentally alter my approach to everything. I decided to approach my most familiar techniques as if I had never seen them before. I would stand in front of a wooden dummy, and instead of executing the movements I had performed thousands of times, I would ask myself, if I knew nothing about martial arts, nothing about proper form, nothing about traditional methods, how would I naturally respond to this target? What would my body want to do if it wasn't constrained by everything I thought I knew? The results were revolutionary. I discovered that my accumulated knowledge, while valuable, had also become a prison. A prison. I had been performing movements because that's how I had learned them, not because they were the most efficient or natural way to achieve the objective. This led me to one of the most important realizations of my entire life. Knowledge isn't power. Applied knowledge isn't even power. The ability to let go of knowledge when it no longer serves you, that's power. The courage to question everything you've accepted as true, that's power. The wisdom to approach each new situation as if you're encountering it for the first time, regardless of how many similar situations you've faced before, that's real power. Most people, once they achieve a certain level of competence, spend the rest of their lives trying to prove how much they know. But the true masters, they spend their lives discovering how much they don't know. Let me tell you about the 3 types of knowledge that will imprison you if you're not careful. And I learned this the hard way. The first is inherited knowledge, the things you learned from others without questioning. When I first began studying martial arts, I accepted everything my instructors taught me as absolute truth. I memorized forms, repeated techniques, absorbed philosophies without ever asking whether these methods were optimal for me, for my body, for my specific goals and circumstances. It took me years to realize that much of what I had learned was simply one person's interpretation of effective movement, filtered through generations of other people's interpretations. None of it was wrong, but none of it was necessarily right for me either. The second type of imprisoning knowledge is experiential knowledge that has become rigid. This is perhaps the most dangerous because it feels so valid. You've tried something, it worked, so you conclude that this is the way it should always be done. I fell into this trap repeatedly. I would discover a technique that was highly effective in sparring, and then I would begin to see every fighting situation through the lens of that technique. I would force new problems into old solutions rather than allowing new problems to reveal new possibilities. Your mind becomes like a hammer, and every challenge starts to look like a nail. The third and most subtle form of imprisoning knowledge is conceptual knowledge, the beliefs and principles you've adopted about how things work. This was my greatest challenge. I had absorbed so many philosophical concepts about martial arts, about effectiveness, about the nature of combat, that I stopped seeing situations as they actually were and started seeing them as my concepts, seeing them as my concepts suggested they should be. I was fighting my ideas about fighting rather than responding to what was actually happening in front of me. The breakthrough came when I realized that true learning requires what I came to call productive ignorance. This isn't about becoming stupid or forgetting everything you've learned. It's about maintaining a state of mind that is simultaneously informed and empty, experienced and curious, knowledgeable and willing to be wrong. It's about holding your understanding lightly, like water in cupped hands, useful when you need it, but easily released when something better comes along. I started practicing what I called the beginner's eyes exercise. Every day I would choose one familiar activity and approach it as if I had never done it before. Sometimes it was as simple as walking upstairs. Instead of automatically moving in my habitual pattern, I would pay attention to each step, each shift of weight, each muscular engagement, as if I was discovering the mechanics of stair climbing for the first time. Other times, I would pick up my nunchucks and handle them as if I had never seen such objects before, letting my hands discover their natural relationship to these unusual tools without any preconceptions about proper technique. The results were startling. I began to notice details I had overlooked for years. I discovered inefficiencies in movements I had considered perfected. I found new possibilities hiding within familiar actions. But, most importantly, I rediscovered the joy of learning. When you approach something with beginner's eyes, every moment becomes a discovery. Every repetition reveals something new. Every practice session becomes an adventure rather than a routine. This is what I mean when I say that true learning begins when you realize you know nothing. It's not about actually knowing nothing. It's about choosing to approach each moment from a place of not knowing, regardless of how much you might actually know. But here's where most people struggle with this concept. They think that admitting they don't know something is a sign of weakness, a confession of inadequacy. In our society, we're trained to have opinions about everything, to present ourselves as knowledgeable and confident. The phrase, "I don't know," feels like an admission of failure. But I discovered something that completely reversed this perspective. Saying, "I don't know," isn't a confession of ignorance. It's a declaration of freedom. It's the statement that liberates you from the burden of having to defend previous conclusions and opens you to infinite new possibilities. I remember a conversation with a reporter who asked me about my fighting philosophy. Instead of giving him the polished answer he expected, I said, "I don't know what my fighting philosophy is." He looked confused, perhaps thinking I was being evasive. But I explained to him that a philosophy, by definition, is a fixed set of beliefs about how things work, and the moment I fix my beliefs about fighting, I stop discovering new ways to fight. The moment I conclude that I understand combat, I stop learning about combat. My philosophy, if I had to name it, was to have no philosophy, to remain perpetually open to what each new moment might teach me. This brings me to one of the most dangerous traps in all of learning, and it's something I see everywhere, not just in martial arts, but in business, relationships, but in business, creative pursuits, every area of human development. It's what I call expertise paralysis. It happens when people become so invested in their identity as someone who knows something that they can't afford to be wrong about it anymore. They've built their reputation, their career, their sense of self around being the person with the answers. So when new information emerges that challenges their established knowledge, they can't embrace it because doing so would threaten their entire identity. I watched this happen to many traditional martial artists when I began developing my own methods. They couldn't consider the possibility that there might be more effective ways to train or fight because they had spent decades mastering the traditional ways. To admit that there might be better approaches would mean admitting that they had wasted years of their lives. So instead of investigating new possibilities, they dismissed them. They chose to protect their investment in old knowledge rather than risk discovering new truth. But here's what I learned. The most successful people in any field are not those who know the most. They're those who learn the fastest. And learning fast requires the ability to let go of what you thought you knew when it no longer serves you. It requires what I call intellectual courage, the bravery to admit when you're wrong, the willingness to appear ignorant in the short term in order to become wiser in the long term. This is why children learn so quickly. They haven't yet developed the ego investment in being right that slows down adult learning. I decided to approach my entire life like a laboratory. Every interaction became an experiment. Every technique became a hypothesis to be tested rather than a truth to be defended. When I worked with actors in Hollywood, instead of approaching each role with preconceived ideas about how the character should move or fight, I would ask, what would this specific person, with this specific background and this specific emotional state, naturally do in this situation? I stopped imposing my knowledge of martial arts on the character and started letting the character teach me about their unique expression of movement. This approach revolutionized not just my acting, but my entire understanding of human potential. I realized that every person I met, regardless of their experience level, had something to teach me if I approached them with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined knowledge. The beginning student who asked the obvious question often revealed assumptions I had never examined. The advanced practitioner who did things differently than I did opened windows to new possibilities I had never considered. But this practice of not knowing isn't easy. Your ego will resist it fiercely. There's a part of your mind that desperately wants to feel knowledgeable, competent, expert. This part of you will whisper that admitting ignorance makes you look weak, that saying, I don't know, undermines your authority, that appearing uncertain will cause others to lose confidence in you. And sometimes, in certain contexts, this might even be true in the short term. But in the long term, the person who is willing to appear ignorant in order to learn something new will always surpass the person who pretends to know everything in order to protect their image. I want to share with you a specific incident that crystallized this understanding for me. I was teaching a group of advanced students, people who had been training for years, when a complete beginner walked into the class. He asked if he could observe. I welcomed him. As I was demonstrating a complex technique, this beginner raised his hand and asked, "Oh, why do you do it that way instead of this way?" And he showed me a movement that was completely wrong, according to everything I had been taught. My first instinct was to correct him, to explain why his approach wouldn't work. But something made me pause. Instead of immediately dismissing his suggestion, I tried it. And to my amazement, his wrong way was actually more efficient for accomplishing the specific objective we were working on. This moment taught me something profound. Expertise can be a form of blindness. When you know the right way to do something, you stop seeing other ways to do it. When you understand how something is supposed to work, you miss opportunities to discover how it could work differently or better. The beginner's ignorance of proper technique actually freed him to see possibilities that my knowledge had obscured. His not knowing revealed options that my knowing had hidden. And that day forward, I made it a practice to regularly put myself in situations where I was the beginner, where I genuinely didn't know what I was doing. I would study different martial arts styles, not to master them, but to experience again what it felt like to be confused, to make mistakes, to not have the answers. I would engage in conversations about subjects I knew nothing about, not to prove my intelligence, but to rediscover the joy of learning something entirely new. I would approach familiar activities with unfamiliar methods, deliberately disrupting my established patterns to see what new patterns might emerge. This practice of intentional ignorance became one of my most powerful tools for continued growth and growth. But it required developing what I came to think of as cognitive humility, the strength to be weak, the confidence to be uncertain, the wisdom to be foolish. In our culture, we're taught that intelligence means having answers, sir. But I discovered that true intelligence often means having better questions. The person who asks the most revealing questions is usually learning more than the person who gives the most polished answers. Now, I want to address something that might be troubling you as you listen to this. You might be thinking, if I adopt this mindset of not knowing, won't people lose respect for me? Won't I undermine my credibility in my profession? Won't I appear in my profession? Won't I appear incompetent? These are valid concerns, and I won't pretend that practicing intellectual humility doesn't come with risks. There are indeed situations where you need to project confidence and certainty, where admitting ignorance could have serious consequences. But here's what I've observed over decades of watching people learn and grow. The individuals who advance furthest in any field are those who balance confidence in their current abilities with humility about their current limitations. They know what they know, but they also know what they don't know. Constantly working to expand the boundaries of both. They project competence in areas where they are genuinely competent, but they admit ignorance in areas where they genuinely lack knowledge. This combination of confidence and humility actually increases rather than decreases others' trust in them. Think about the people you most respect. Are they the ones who pretend to know everything, who never admit uncertainty? who always have confident answers regardless of the question? Or are they the ones who demonstrate expertise in their areas of strength while honestly acknowledging the limits of their knowledge? I've found that people actually trust more those who admit what they don't know, because it gives them confidence that when these individuals claim to know something, they really do know it hard. This brings me to one of the most practical applications of this principle: how to approach learning anything new. Whether you're starting a business, developing a skill, entering a relationship, or pursuing any significant goal, your success will depend largely on your ability to maintain what Zen practitioners call beginner's mind. And this doesn't mean approaching everything as if you have no relevant knowledge or experience. It means approaching everything as if there's still more to discover than you currently understand. When I decided to pursue acting seriously, I could have approached it from the perspective of a martial artist bringing his skills to film. Instead, I chose to approach it as a complete beginner learning an entirely new art form. Yes, my physical abilities gave me certain advantages, but I didn't let those advantages prevent me from learning the fundamentals of acting from the ground up. I studied with acting coaches, observed experienced actors, read about different acting methods. I approached each role not as a martial artist playing a character, but as an actor who happened to have martial arts skills.